almost everything in disagreement that feels really good to ourselves is probably destructive to the relationship. It's very hard to wield influence if you keep walking away from people and walking away from conversations because you don't think that they're sort of worthy of being engaged with.
That's Julia Minson. She's a psychologist and lecturer from the Harvard Kennedy School who specializes in the study of disagreement and conflict. Her work focuses on how people can communicate across differences without conversations becoming hostile or unproductive. Her new book, How to Disagree Better, is a guide on how to disagree without burning bridges. So you'll learn 1, the HERE framework for productive disagreements, 2, the key to avoiding a stalemate in an argument, and 3, simple phrases that communicate curiosity instead of judgment. I'm Pete Bakaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Julia. Julia, welcome.
Great to be here.
I'm excited to chat about disagreeing better. Could you start us off with a key thing you've observed time and time again, like the top thing you see that folks get wrong about disagreeing?
I think there's 2 things that sound like the opposite of each other, but they're actually the same thing. On one hand, people avoid disagreement because they feel like intensely uncomfortable with it and sort of like really don't want to get into it. And then on the other hand, you see people sort of flying off the handle and getting into very aggressive disagreements. And you see both of these problems sort of all the time. And they're actually related, right? Because it's usually when a person is avoiding something for a long time, eventually they sort of like blow a gasket and then end up expressing their perspective in a very unstructured and unhelpful way.
Okay. Well, and this is a learnable thing to not do that and to disagree better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a psychologist at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have spent my career trying to figure out how to help people do this better. And there's really some very concrete things that we get wrong that if we fix them, life can get easier. Conversations can get more productive.
Beautiful. Well, could you tell us a cool story of someone who saw a transformation in that regard?
Sure. Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know if you've heard this saying, all research is me search, right? So a lot of the time academics study the type of thing that gives them the most difficulty. And I am absolutely the kind of person that used to be extraordinarily argumentative. I'm pretty smart, and I used to love to show it to everybody who would listen. And I just learned over time that you get a lot more mileage by trying to understand where the other person is coming from, because, so often you start arguing and you don't actually know what the argument is about, right? You are sort of pushing a point and you don't understand why the other person is resisting. But if you have some sense of where they're coming from, it just really sort of transforms the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've got a cool concept, a turn of a phrase, conversational receptiveness. And I just think that is a very handy thing to have tattooed into our brains, if you will. Tell us, what does that mean and how is it helpful?
So receptiveness to opposing views is your sort of tendency to think hard about stuff you disagree with, right? So we normally, as humans, do a really good job thinking about ideas we agree with, and we ignore or look for flaws in ideas we disagree with. So for a long time, I was sort of really interested in this thing of like, are some people better at putting as much thought and putting as much effort into ideas they disagree with as ideas they do agree with? And you could think like, look, that's probably a good idea because I will end up being a smarter, more well-rounded person. But once we've figured out how you can measure people's receptiveness, we also realize that people are quite bad at expressing it, right? So I can be thinking really hard about your perspective. I can be like putting in all this intellectual effort, but you have no idea. So as the person I'm speaking with, if you don't know that I'm trying, we are just as likely to have sort of a very negative conversation and experience, a bunch of conflict escalation and bad feelings towards each other if you don't know that I am trying to listen to you. So conversational receptiveness is a way to express the fact that you're being receptive using words, right? Using language so that it's like totally obvious and totally transparent to other people.
Okay. Well, could you give us maybe a demonstration of some key phrases or indicators which share, hey, I'm receptive versus I'm not receptive?
So the best way to memorize kind of the basics of conversational receptiveness is using what we call the HEAR framework. So HEAR, as in I hear you. And each letter stands for something, kind of a different idea. So the H stands for hedging. So you might want to say, for example, look, COVID vaccines are safe and effective, right? That's a pretty sort of dogmatic statement. And a person who disagrees with you will start looking for holes in your argument and looking for counterexamples of, they heard that somebody had some kind of vaccine side effect. Instead, you could say, look, most physicians tend to believe that COVID vaccines are largely safe and effective, right? So most tend to and largely are all ways of kind of hedging my claim, right? So it's words like perhaps, maybe, occasionally, some people, right? And what it does is it really kind of takes this wind out of your counterpart sails, right? It's like you've demonstrated with your words that you understand that there is, in fact, another perspective, and you're leaving a little bit of room for it, right? So that's the H. The E stands for emphasizing agreement. So the idea behind conversational receptiveness is not that we have to agree, right? It's not that I have to like change my mind. I have to compromise, I have to like meet you in the middle and, give you a hug. It's that I recognize that 82 humans agree on some stuff, right? It could be that we're both concerned with something. It could be that we're both upset about something. It could be that we just have some values that are in common. So words like, I also want to, or I am also concerned with, or we both would like to see, XYZ happen, just sort of puts us on the same side of the table for a second. The A stands for acknowledgement. So taking a couple minutes to restate your counterpart's perspective before you launch into your own argument. I hear that it's really important to you that this project is delivered at a particular level of quality, right? Or I understand that you're very concerned about the hours that the team has been working. So it's using my own words to demonstrate to you, like unambiguously, that I was listening when you were talking. And finally, the R stands for reframing to the positive. So dropping negative and contradictory words like no, can't, won't, don't, terrible, hate, kill, and replacing them with some more positively balanced words like it would be wonderful if, or I appreciated when, or great, right? So I hated when people push me into stressful decisions. Stop could be replaced with I really appreciate it when people give me more time to consider important choices. Thank you for understanding, right? So kind of like same content, but a very different flavor. So HEAR.
Okay. And so then you said using words. I mean, those are all words. I guess I'm curious also if there's a degree of nonverbal things that convey receptiveness or lack thereof.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, you can imagine, right? Like if a person is nodding, if they're smiling, if they're not interrupting you, all of those things seem more receptive than the opposite. It tends to be the case that words are easier to control than our bodies and actually easier to interpret than our bodies, right? So a lot of the time when people are listening hard, they look very serious and they kind of look sullen and they look like they're staring into space. And, it's not because they're not listening. It's actually because they're working really hard, right? And so it's very easy to interpret, or it's very easy to misinterpret body language to mean something different. And people like misinterpret language all the time. But language is clearer, right? So it's like when we're choosing between two imperfect tools, words are clearer than body language.
When it comes to acknowledging the other perspective, are there any tweaks you might put on the traditional notions of active listening, or is that just what this is?
Yeah, so active listening is a really sort of interesting idea because it's a mix of like stuff that happens in your head, right? The actual listening, and nonverbal stuff like nodding and smiling and eye contact, and some sounds like aha and huh, and then some restating. And it's really unclear from that whole kind of like menu of stuff what's important, right? What really does the work for you? Like if I'm nodding but not smiling, like does that work or do I have to also be smiling? We focus on the language because you really can't fake it. Like for me to restate what you said in a way that's accurate, I had to have listened to you. I can nod and smile all day long and have no idea what you're actually saying. But for me to restate your words, that's unfalsifiable proof that I was actually paying attention when you were talking. So that's sort of why the focus on restating.
Okay. And when it comes to the nods and ahas and okays, am I hearing you say that it's unknown in the research if that is getting it done or not?
So it's not that it's unknown. So we actually ran a very fun study where we wanted to see, like, people always talk about how important it is to be a good listener, right? We've all kind of agree on the fact that good listening is important. And what we wanted to see is how good are folks at judging whether the other person is being a good listener, right? So imagine the setup where there's a small lab room. It's a, little slightly larger than your bathroom probably. And people go in there and it's two strangers. And what we tell them is that you need to have a conversation with this other person and get to know them, for example, as if you wanted to, have them be a roommate, right? Like, what are the things you would ask them about and learn from them if you were interviewing them as a potential roommate? And in the room, there's two chairs. And behind one of the chairs, there's a screen on the wall. And the screen is playing this like ongoing loop of commercials that are on mute. Okay. And so one person sits down and their back is to the screen. And they walked in and they noticed the screen and we're like, just ignore the screen. Doesn't matter. The other person sits down and they're facing the screen, right? So they're facing their conversation partner and this person also has the screen behind them. And that person got special instructions. And so their special instructions are either ignore the screen, talk to your counterpart, get to know them, or pretend you're listening and we will pay you extra money if you can memorize all the products for which there are the commercials on the screen.
Okay.
Right. So it's like if you go on a date, right? It's like if you go on a date and there's like football game playing like above the bar and you're wondering if your date is listening to you or like watching football above your head, like this is the experience. And so then the person who had their back to the screen, what they have to do is they have to guess which condition their partner was in. So afterwards, we tell them, we're like, hey, some people were instructed to listen carefully and some people were instructed to, memorize commercials behind your head. Which condition do you think your person was in? Turns out that people are terrible at this task.
Terrible at guessing.
They're terrible at guessing because they all think that the person sitting across from them who is nodding and smiling is listening to them, even though they're not actually listening because they're trying to memorize this other thing because they're getting paid extra money for memorizing this other thing. And so you could imagine, right, like in a meeting, for example, at work, you see this all the time. There's a room full of people that's nodding and smiling and maybe even like typing on their laptops, right? But what they're actually typing is, their grocery list, right? Or like they're writing like whatever, an email to their family, right? You have no idea what information is actually getting through.
Well, that's fascinating in and of itself. So I guess one takeaway is, hey, if you fake that you're listening, you're going to fool the other person. So I guess good to know, but that doesn't seem like a great strategy to do.
Well, it depends, right? Like it depends on whose perspective you are looking at, right? So if you are trapped in an awkward situation and you're just killing time, people are like very good at faking listening, smiling, like enjoyment, all of those things. Like we are good at sort of getting along with people. If you're the person who's trying to make sure that something is getting done, right? If you're running this meeting, if you're trying to brief people on a new project plan, if you need to make sure that, everybody's ducks are in a row, then you need to look for more reliable signals of listening.
Okay. Well, that's super handy. Well, that HERE framework, I like it. And it seems to make great sense as you lay it out there for us. I'm curious if there are any finer points or distinctions or hiccups or little things that trip people up when they're trying to execute this.
The most common, I think, first experience is that it's harder than people imagine it to be. So it seems super easy. You're like, oh, HEAR, I can memorize the words and I can say them. But when you are in a disagreement, what you're mostly thinking about is how to win, right? You're thinking about how to come up with the best argument. And so now I'm asking you to like do this extra thing that you have to do on top of thinking how to win, which might also feel like it's going to prevent you from winning, right? Because you now have to think about your counterpart's argument and you have to take it seriously. And so people just find that it takes some cognitive effort and it takes some practice. In the beginning, like I always liken it to playing piano, right? Like the first time you play piano, it does not sound like music. And so this feels awkward and effortful. And then with some rounds of repetition, people start kind of getting into the groove of it and becoming much more fluid at it. So I would say the first thing to do is to not give up when it feels awkward the first time.
Well, I think that's a really key point there. We have a lot of our attentional resources on how to win generally. And it sounds like that may not be the ideal stance in order to really listen and hear and receive someone's perspective in the first place.
Well, I mean, it kind of like brings up another really fascinating idea for me, which is that how many times have you walked into a conversation and thought, okay, what is my goal here? What am I trying to accomplish? Do I have strategies that are going to help me achieve my goal? And those, are those the right strategies? Most people don't think about their goals unless it's sort of a very important conversation that you have been planning for a long time. And so when we enter a disagreement, it's usually spontaneous, right? Like you're sitting there having a conversation, somebody says something and you're like, oh no, you're wrong. Let me fix you. So our first immediate goal sort of stems from this assumption that I'm right, you're wrong. I'm going to tell you how it is, right? And quite often that doesn't serve us well. So the question of what am I trying to do and what's the right strategy to do it, I think is a really, really important piece of all of this.
Oh, that's super. So it sounds like you may be saying if we don't take time in advance to thoughtfully consider our goals, the default goal is winning, fixing them, being right.
That's right. And then, of course, like if you have two people who are both pursuing that goal with some gusto, what you end up with is a stalemate. Nobody gives in, nobody's listening, and eventually people get frustrated with each other. And, either it escalates into a fight or you just walk away from it and you're sort of like, yeah, this person isn't going to listen to reason. And that's terrible, right? And like in the workplace, because both people are frustrated, nothing got done, and you have sort of soured potential relationship.
Well, if the default goal is how to win, can you suggest some alternative goals that may very well be worth focusing on and pursuing in a given conversation?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that there's so many that people don't think about. If I'm with my manager, right, I might just want to impress them with like how smart I am, right? Or I could want to be funny, or I could want to just pass the time because we're stuck at the airport together. Or I could want to show that I am sort of really well versed in a particular topic. My favorite goal, and I think the goal that serves disagreements the best, is the goal of understanding what exactly your counterpart believes and why they believe it, right? So in order to make any kind of progress on the disagreement, I need to know sort of like what you're all about, right? And quite often, and I have this experience all the time. People come to me with a disagreement. Since my book has come out, I've had these like totally wild conversations where I'm signing books and somebody sort of stops the line and says, Julia, can I ask you for advice on like this? And then they start telling me sort of like this long extended story about their friend or their life partner who doesn't do this or does something else. And I always say to them, I'm like, have you asked them why they think that's the right way to behave? And I often get one of two responses. Either a person is just completely baffled and they're like, no, I haven't asked them. Like, thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to go ask them. Right. Which to me just sort of like boggles my mind that somebody's been in a conflict for, days or weeks or years and has never asked their counterpart why they believe what they believe. Or I think the more potentially risky one is people say, no, I haven't asked them, but I know they're this kind of person and they were brought up in this kind of family and this is why they're like that. And so there's sort of like this set of assumptions about you think that other person believes what they believe for some set of reasons that you have essentially made up in your head and haven't tested by asking the question, like, tell me more about your beliefs.
Well, yes, a set of assumptions. And I found my assumptions are often incorrect. And so it's well worth asking. I like you said, ask why they believe what they believe. And you used the phrase, tell me more. I've heard that sometimes a why question can trigger defensiveness. Do you have any favorite approaches or questions you like to use in unearthing this stuff?
Yeah, I think people in general struggle with asking questions or making statements that signal their willingness to understand, their desire to understand, and aren't like gotcha phrases in sort of question form. So you could say, why do you believe that? Right? That sounds like an attack. Or I could say, look, I'm really curious to understand why you believe that. Right? That sounds more like curiosity. And the why is there. But I think the real, I have sort of this mental bar that I set for myself is if I asked a question that makes me feel superior in a disagreement, I shouldn't have asked it. Right? Like if I feel I just scored a point, then I'm actually losing, right? I'm losing at my own game of sounding curious and trying to gather information from the other person. Almost everything in disagreement that feels really good to ourselves is probably destructive to the relationship.
Oh, I hear you. So if you're disagreeing on a science issue, you say, well, then why is it numerous systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials have showed, in fact, the exact opposite is what happens in experimental conditions.
Right.
Suck on that, like.
Right. Or how do you explain blah, blah, blah?
Sure.
Right.
Okay. That's a nice little internal emotional indicator there. All right. Well, I'd also love to hear if in the whole emotional game here, in terms of you want to win, there's high stakes, you feel threatened or intimidated or disrespected. We can get hijacked in this emotional land. Any pro tips for dealing with all that?
So emotional regulation, right, is something that people struggle with, but is doable. And, it's not just for conflict, it's for all sorts of other things. A lot of the times, I'm going to say things that after the fact sound totally obvious, but are profoundly true. Our emotions come from our brains, right, which are ultimately physical organs that need rest and food and water. And so quite often, if you are feeling yourself overtaken by emotions, what that means is it's time to take a break, right? It's time to take a break from this conversation, or it's time to take just like a break, right? And it goes back to this point of planning. Quite often we end up in disagreements spontaneously with no forethought. And often we fly off the handle because we are tired and because we're stressed out. And, it's Thanksgiving dinner and like everybody's had a drink or two and it's in the evening. And there's all kinds of physiological and situational reasons why we are not at our best at that moment. And so, one, if we have the ability to plan a conversation, prepare yourself to do it at a time when you're at your best. And if you don't have the ability to plan the conversation, you can always pause it and say, look, this sounds important. I'd like to talk to you about this thoughtfully. Can we schedule coffee for next week? Right. So like when somebody comes after you, over dinner about like, well, why haven't you guys gotten married yet? Right. Or something like incredibly sort of like personal and triggering and random that, can come up at a strange time. You don't have to entertain it right then and there.
Okay, that's super. So just having it planned for a time when you're at your best and you're sort of mentally prepped for it, as opposed to surprised, shell shocked, like, oof, getting disrupted. I'd love to hear if, for whatever reason, that's not so possible. Oh, we got a meeting with the big account or the big executive, and I'm not going to be able to get back on that calendar for months. Do you have any pro tips for in the moment dealing with the stuff?
Yeah. So back to sort of this idea of question asking and inquiry and showing curiosity. There's two ways of thinking about this, right? There's sort of like, are you trying to help your counterpart have a better experience? And are you trying to calm yourself down? And those things are intimately related, right? Because when we're in a conversation, when we're in a disagreement, the way you're reacting to me is what's causing my emotions, right? So if I can slow it down long enough to get you to calm down, it will also calm me down, right? I mean, I think one of the things that people really sort of forget about disagreement is that it is a dynamic interpersonal process. Like you can't disagree by yourself in a vacuum. And so if I can stop myself from trying to make the argument and instead say, hey, I'd like to understand where you're coming from. I'd like to understand why this matters to you. Tell me why this is a big deal. That very simple action tends to make the other person calmer, explain their perspective, kind of appreciate the fact that they were asked. And then that gives me a chance to calm down. So the two things really like reinforce each other. The contrast is I make a forceful argument, you make a forceful argument. I have to make my argument even more forceful. Next thing you know, we're yelling at each other.
I think that's really quite brilliant because you get a moment to regroup and the spotlight is off you. So maybe they do ask and you can't escape or reschedule. It's like, why haven't you gotten married yet? And you're like, whoa, what the heck, man? That's kind of none of your business. We're going to live our life the way we see fit. Thank you very much. So, but instead of saying that with that question of, oh, this seems like this timeline is really important to you. Can you tell me more about that? So a question along those lines shifts the spotlight off of you and can make them feel appreciated and lets you take a breath and recollect all at the same time.
Exactly. And I mean, honestly, you can keep going and going. Like, oh, are you married? How long have you been married? How's it going? Do you have kids? Like, you can ask many questions, which serves dual purposes, right? One is what you just mentioned, which is giving yourself a break. But two, part of the reason that the person asked the question is because they have an opinion about what you should be doing with your life, right? And they want to share something. They feel like they have wisdom or advice or insight to offer, right? And so you're asking them, they're going to tell you, and they will feel wonderful about it. And they're going to feel like you're a great listener. And then by the time all is said and done, hopefully you have a way of talking about your perspective that sort of resonates with what they are concerned about.
I like that a lot. And because many of the times it's not really about you at all. They have a belief about how things should be with marriages and timelines and you name it, fertility, population, furthering the species, whatever. They may have an opinion and they're not even directly attacking you. They just generally have some kind of worldview. And so you can inquire about that. And in so doing, they like it. They can talk about it. And you might not even have to return to you at all.
Right. And, this is sort of like great, like we're like running with the marriage example because I just like spontaneously brought it up. But, you could imagine, let's say these are, your parents or like your uncle or whoever it is who, has some stake and they want you to get married because they want you to have kids, which is one conversation. It could be that they want you to get married because they think that it's like financially more responsible to, put all your pennies together and, invest in the American dream, right? That's a totally different conversation. And so the way you sort of talk about it would be different depending on what it is they are concerned with, right? Or it could be sort of this entirely different thing you're suggesting, which is it's not about you at all. It's about their like worldviews about the institution of marriage, which is a third type of conversation.
I like that a lot. And Julia, could you share with us any of your most favorite and least favorite words, scripts, bit of verbiage when it comes to doing this conversational receptiveness thing well?
So the way I think about a whole conversation, right, is like having basically two big activities that you're trying to pursue. You're trying to understand where the other person is coming from. You're trying to gather information. And then at the same time, or like in the same conversation, you're also trying to convey your own set of beliefs and make your own argument. And so overall, people spend way too much time in the second part, right? The part where you're trying to make your own argument. So the first thing I would advise folks to do is to rebalance your attention and your time to spend a lot more time in the place of sort of inquiry and signaling curiosity, right? So all the kind of phrases around, I'd like to know more about how you came to hold this belief. I would love to understand why this is important to you. What would you like to see happen here? Have you seen this thing, whatever it is, done very successfully? Would it be helpful if I did X, Y, and Z? Right. So they're all questions that sort of are like getting around this person's beliefs and values. And then at some point, you're going to feel like, I think I get it. And you might want to say, okay, so I think I get it. Let me tell you what I think I just heard. And you tell me if I did get it or not. Right. And so that's sort of a transition because once you restate what you heard, they might say, well, kind of, but not really. And there's this other thing. And I forgot to mention blah, 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 blah. Right. And so then you might have to spend a little more time there. Or they might say, yeah, that's right. You got it. Thank you for listening to me. I think that's exactly what I was trying to say. Right. And then you switch to the part where you are now making your own argument. And that's where you use the HEAR framework, right? So there you can do your HEAR to show that I have a point of view here. I have a set of beliefs, but I'm going to express it in a way that still like recognizes the fact that I just spent 20 minutes listening to you and I was actually paying attention.
Beautiful. Well, Julia, tell me anything else you want to make sure to mention before we hear about some of your favorite things?
I think that a lot of the time people are hesitant to think about these topics, right? Especially like if we are, for example, debating how to do a project at work, maybe I'll say, well, receptiveness is good. I need to understand where this person is coming from because I need to work with them. But sometimes we get into these topics that feel very moralized, right? Like if we talk about a company's environmental policy, if we talk about affirmative action in hiring, if we talk about medical policies that support reproductive care, like there's a lot of places, there's a lot of topics, even in the workplace, that feel very, very moralized. And I think people are afraid to approach those topics because it feels like, how can I possibly condone that crazy perspective? And that to me seems like a mistake because if you have a passion around a policy area and around a way that you would like to see the world changed, it's very hard to wield influence if you keep walking away from people and walking away from conversations because you don't think that they're sort of worthy of being engaged with. So that's something that I really like people to think about is like, how am I going to wield influence if I don't engage?
Yeah, that's very well said. And when you talk about the moral piece of it, perhaps there's a dimension of us that feels even hearing out and providing a respectful opportunity to air the alternative view, which we may even see as evil, is it to in some way support, condone, approve, welcome, entertain, negotiate with, whatever, the evil. And I think that if we evaluate that, that's really more of an emotional vibes thing as opposed to a logical thing.
Well, it's back to assumptions, right? Like, how do you know they're evil? Like, that's a big word. Like, evil with a capital E, that's like a big accusation, right? So, how do you conclude that, right? Without really thoughtfully engaging with a person and their beliefs. And most of the time, when you really listen to people, they say things that kind of make sense, at least in, some dimensions or from the perspective that they see the world from. And frankly, even like the people who are evil, if you're in a conversation with them, it is often because you need them to achieve a certain goal. If you can sort of like relegate them to, the like eighth circle of hell and never have to deal with them again, that's great. But most of the time, we don't have that power. Most of the time, we actually need to get things done. And so again, if you're going to get things done, you have to understand the other side.
Well, yes, we've had Chris Voss and other folks who've done hostage negotiation on the show. And in fact, even folks who are committing evil actions in terms of they have hostages, they're threatening to take their lives, providing some of this understanding stuff is tremendously helpful in untangling that dangerous situation.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I had a student last year who worked for like an immigration nonprofit. And he said, well, how could I possibly have sort of a conversation with these people that work for the government and they're, hauling children away from their parents and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, if you want to help these children, do you think it would be effective to tell this person who is doing their government job, you're a horrible human being and I hate everything you stand for? Like, do you think you're going to get anything out of them after you say that? Right. So there's sort of like the impulse to tell people what exactly we think of them. But again, is it serving your goal?
Well said. Big thanks to Julia for sharing her wisdom with us. And big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. All right. Well, now could you share with us a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
William Wrigley Jr. Remember, like Wrigley's chewing gum, Wrigley's Field? So 100 years ago, he said, when two men in business always agree, one of them is unnecessary.
Okay. And a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
The famous Milgram experiments. The reason they're so important to me, so, in the Milgram studies, right, you had participants who gave other people, trained actors, but of course they didn't know that they were trained actors, gave them electric shocks. And they thought that they were participating in a study on learning. And there was this experimenter in a white lab coat who kept telling them to give this other person electric shocks. And in reality, it was a study of obedience to authority. And for Milgram, this was sort of this whole illustration of what happened in Nazi Germany and how easy it is to get people to obey authority through sort of very subtle changes to the situation. Well, as a little girl, I grew up in Russia. And the reason I'm a psychologist is because my mom was a psychologist. And the reason she was a psychologist was because she read the Milgram studies. So, she was a Jewish woman in the Soviet Union, and it like really resonated with her to the point where she learned English and got a PhD. And here I am a generation later.
Beautiful. And a favorite book?
I read a lot of fantasy, and I really like an author named Alex Harrow. She's got a new novel called The Everlasting that I just like. I wish I could wipe from my brain and read all over again so I could have the experience again.
All right. And a favorite tool?
Espresso maker.
And a favorite habit?
Sitting on the couch after dinner, piled up with my youngest child who's 10 and our dog who's, 70 pounds. And we all watch an episode of Modern Family. And thank God Modern Family is so long that like one episode at a time. We've been doing it for, 2 years.
Is there a key nugget you shared that really seems to connect and resonate with folks? They quote it back to you often?
Everything is negotiable.
All right. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
So my website is disagreeingbetter.com.
Okay. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
next time you disagree with somebody, pause and think about whether you understand where they're coming from. And if you don't, ask.
All right. Julia, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is great.
I love so much Julie's rule of thumb that if it feels good to you in the disagreement, it's probably destructive to the relationship. Even if it doesn't seem that harsh or hostile or snippy or gotcha or in your face or brutal or malicious in any way, just the notion that it feels disproportionately satisfying to say that thing is a handy extra emotional indicator that, probably not the thing to say. Great stuff from Julia. If you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced, please drop on by awesomeatyourjob.com/EP1165. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.